So if you go pick a random indica off a shelf and you go pick a random sativa off a shelf, there is just as good a chance, more or less, that they have the same type of chemical profile as they have a different chemical profile. If you pick up two random indicas, they're just as likely to be different from each other as if you pick up a random indica and sativa, more or less.
Some interesting things which I've learned from your show and that I've heard discussed on some of the episodes. And the first of those is the distinction in the cannabis world between indica and sativa, and people have all kinds of associations that they make with certain strains that they see as indica and other ones that they see as sativa. But apparently the picture isn't as clear cut as that, and that distinction might not make as much sense as we think it does. And could you just talk a bit more about that?
Yes. So I will talk about that. I'll talk a little bit about, so we're actually getting ready to submit a paper. So I'm working on a formal research project with the University of Colorado, looking at all of the lab data that we've gotten through our partnerships at Leafly and dissecting that and comparing the actual chemistry of the cannabis that you see to the labels that are used commercially, including the strain names and including Indica sativa hybrid. So the basic idea of this research project and this paper is, first, let's use like what you would just call data science techniques or analytical techniques to map out the actual chemical diversity of commercial cannabis in the United States. So this paper will contain visualizations that are effectively a literal map of all of the chemical diversity you see in terms of cannabinoids and terpenes in modern commercial cannabis. And we simply ask, how well does that map, based purely on the chemistry, line up with the labels that the brands and the commercial people are applying to products? And the short answer is it doesn't line up very well at all for Indica sativa hybrid, except in one little place there is some lineup. And for strain names, it lines up better than you would expect from random chance, but it's certainly not perfect. So in other words, Indica sativa hybrid, when you go to a dispensary and someone tells you this is an indica, it will make you sleepy, this is a sativa, it will make you energized, that is what you would call folk knowledge. So non-scientifically or systematically acquired knowledge, or I should really call it a belief rather than knowledge per se. It's folk beliefs that have been inherited from cannabis culture, let's just say that. And the reason for it is that cannabis is this sort of beautifully diverse plant. You know, different strains smell different, they look different, they can feel different according to what people often tell you. It certainly looks like there's lots of differences there. It certainly smells like there's lots of differences there. And it seems to be that, you know, you get different experiences from different types of strains. The reason that these things don't line up is really because, you know, all of that knowledge and all of that nomenclature evolved in a state of prohibition. Right? So for decades and decades and decades, through the 20th and 21st century up until very recently, you know, growers were hybridizing and creating new strains all over the place in the United States. There was a nomenclature that they sort of inherited kind of from taxonomists, you know, the notion of, okay, indica, sativa, strains from closer to the equator versus, you know, Afghanistan versus other places of the world. These strains look different, and they behave differently in terms of how they're grown and how they grow because they're locally adapted, these landrace strains, to the environments they came from. But then there's all this hybridization that happens. There's no lab testing. There's no quality testing in terms of what the chemistry actually is because, right, we're in a state of prohibition. That's illegal. There's no mechanism for doing that. So people are sort of in the dark. All they have is their eyes, their nose, and their mind from what happens to it when they consume cannabis. There's no standardized way of talking about these things. And so, you know, it makes sense that these names and these labels are not lining up perfectly with what you see in the chemistry. What's sort of remarkable is that they line up at all. So as I mentioned, when you look at the chemistry and you look at the Indica sativa hybrid nomenclature of the industry, and you look at the full landscape, it really doesn't line up very well. But there is this one sort of patch or neighborhood in the chemical landscape where you see an overrepresentation of certain sativas and underrepresentation of indicas. And we point that out in our research that will come out relatively soon and talk about why that might be. But the short answer, to sort of summarize all that and compress it, is the use of indica and sativa as a reliable marker of relaxing versus energizing cannabis in the commercial industry today is not very useful. It's not very meaningful. It's based mostly on folk knowledge, not legitimate, scientifically validated knowledge. So if you go pick a random indica off a shelf and you go pick a random sativa off a shelf, there is just as good a chance, more or less, that they have the same type of chemical profile as they have a different chemical profile. If you pick up two random indicas, they're just as likely to be different from each other as if you pick up a random indica and sativa, more or less. So those categories just don't line up with the chemistry very well at all. Nonetheless, there are different chemistries, and I do think that it's plausible that there are different types of cannabis that will reliably, on average, cause different types of effects. It's just not aligned with the nomenclature of the industry.
So do you think a new nomenclature will arise out of, the work that you're currently doing? Is that something that you're working on?
The hope would be that a new nomenclature would arise. There's definitely a lot of people in the industry interested in doing this, interested in creating a nomenclature that is based on a firm foundation of chemotyping cannabis, understanding the chemistry of the products, and tying that to the genotype that gives rise to these chemical patterns. I think it's doable. I think it will be attempted, and it is being attempted. The question is really around adoption. So on the one hand, the indica sativa nomenclature is just completely ingrained in the industry and how people talk about this. And for better or worse, that's just true. It doesn't line up with the actual chemistry very well at all. It's not going to be a reliable predictor for people of what's going to give them one type of effect versus another. So any new nomenclature is fighting an uphill battle. And so I think you either need to have a nomenclature that's rooted in science and you have sort of the marketing power behind it and the productization of it needs to be well enough executed that you can fight that uphill battle for probably a number of years to displace the existing nomenclature. And even then, I don't think you'll get a complete displacement. It's just too
well established,
it's too
well
lodged.
Ingrained.
Yeah. The other thing would be, a regulatory solution. So, if and when cannabis becomes federally legal in the US, if the government chose to impose some sort of unifying standard on how certain things can be named and what is required for a product to be able to put a certain label on the box, I think that's a possibility. I don't necessarily think it's likely, but that is one possibility.
Yeah, well, you're quite a bit further ahead in the US than we are in the UK, but that's a conversation for